Hello everyone, today we talk about the Symmacharii or Symmachiarii in the Roman army. So this is a relatively less known topic than the usual because we're talking essentially about a unit we don't know much about, how it was organized. It's also a term that recurs relatively rarely. We will mostly concentrate into the 3rd century where we start having probably a better shaping of these units, but probably we will see how these typologies really could, even the names that were used to define them could really vary. Semantically speaking, it's a bit complicated. So we will objectively not solve the problem, but we will come up with certain hypotheses, some better, some worse, of course. But given in the meanwhile broader picture of the world matter, and basically the involvement of these practically unit of auxiliaries. If you really want to give a definition to the Symmachiarii or Symmacharii, that's basically what you want to give. So first of all, the name is actually a Latinization of a Greek term that would be this Symmachiarii. So it would be the friends, the allies, and in fact, the Symmacharii were practically the equivalent in later times to the Greek linguistical equivalent of the federati in Latin. Here it's the Latinization of a term that basically stresses, that when you add to an adjective determination rius, ria, etc. It's as if these guys had been friends for not really for profession, but as if these were involved into the craft of being kind of friends, auxiliaries, as you want to call them, and also the fact that this is a Latinized Greek terms naturally also speaks for the how now the Roman Empire was transforming with this the presence of this terminology in the same army that were influenced by Greek, even though Latin actually would have a much wider influence. It would remain effectively the language of the army even into pretty late, up to Heraclius, if I'm not wrong. But this is not really the point. The point is really figuring out who these guys were. So if you go look at the definition, basically this would have been, as we've said, auxiliaries, and fundamentally certain foreign troops most of the times were hired, maybe temporarily, maybe not, essentially to fight in their native style with their weapons, with their essentially tactical specialties. And this is really nothing new in the Roman army, as you understand, because auxiliaries had been always there. In old times, the Roman army was composed, basically born by foreign troops, by auxiliaries, than actual Roman citizens. You can see that during the Second Punic War, even at this moment of glory of the Roman Republic. From a military point of view, you find that the essentially the majority of the Roman army was made up by the Italic Soci, or Soci, as you want to say. So this was perfectly normal, and you can argue that the reason why the Roman army was so successful was because of the integration of these foreign elements that basically catalyzed those forces that existed in the process of Romanization from these tribal peoples that Rome came to conquer, that were quite warlike and had, in this sense, manpower and strengths and abilities and skills and expertise to put into practice into the craft of war, and the eventual gentrification that ultimately brought to, let's say, even the shortage of qualified military manpower within the same empire, in terms of these ethnic components that had made up even the specialists into the Roman army, like especially skirmishers, lighter troops, slingers, but also other troops for which Rome now still could recruit legionaries and train them, etc. But in terms within the boundaries of the empire, but now they couldn't basically access this pool of manpower, of ethnic manpower, specialized manpower, from within the borders had to find it elsewhere. So this is important because at the end of the day, there would seem not to be a huge technical difference between these various troops that we've seen. We will talk about the irregular auxilia, we will talk about the Numeri, and also the Federati, but these are names that behind, the different forms of organization, and also considering where these guys came from, essentially were practically the same thing. I mean, there were still auxiliaries that were drawn from kind of, let's say, foreign, or at least allogen populations in the Roman Empire that participated to the Roman army in exchange of something. Mostly were drawn for the opportunity of a pay, also a career, the opportunity eventually for their children to become, and definitely for them to obtain the Roman citizenship, to make a career into the empire. Not just a military one, but also a civil one, a political one. And we know that the Roman Empire was pretty open and inclusive in this sense. So the whole system of Rome basically gravitated around even this need of the so-called barbarians to get Romanized and practically participating to the Roman lifestyle that they definitely saw as a profitable thing. Absolutely, the myth that the barbarians want to destroy the Roman world is obviously absurd. These guys were quite interested, and it was normal for all these populations to gravitate around the empire and searching for opportunities of job, of work, even as soldiers. So this was perfectly normal. Naturally, this happened also in less peaceful ways, because, as we will see, part of these troops were also drawn forcibly. So it wasn't much of an option at a certain point, but at the same time it still worked by a complex net of systems, especially on the frontiers and so on, of clienteles, of alliances and so on. So it was mostly the aristocracies also that participated into the process of sending troops for fighting with the Romans, for getting something in exchange politically, and so on. This is not, however, the point. The point is, now we will look in depth what this term Symmacharius or Symmachiarii actually meant, and what it was into the Roman army organization in practice. And we will not arrive to a conclusion. I already tell you, that I have my own opinion, but we will have to explain in relative detail what this work looked like. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. Here we go. So, as we've seen since ever, practically, now we're talking about the empire, essentially. We arrive at the time of Caracalla, because this is where we have the greatest amount of information about the role of the Symmachiarii or Symmacharii. So, we've seen that the Romans had encouraged several troops of barbarian origin to basically maintain their Bellic traditions, their kind of specializations. For instance, Hadrian was praised by Arrian, that is also one of the most important sources we'll look today, for the initiative of essentially maintaining alive in certain barbarian units the ethnic skills of their fighting style. And when we look at the early imperial sources, we will look at these foreigners that basically joined the army with the generical name of Numeri, or Nationes or Nationes, depending on how you want to prefer to talk about them. So these terms are actually similar, because Numeri is kind of more frequent. These were actual units. I mean, they had they actually corresponded to a proper unit that was identifiable and so on. But also, in general, this term was more generically extended to all the foreign troops that were hired in different ways at this point from either certain border areas of the empire or even beyond, even sometimes. So some of these troops were irregulars, initially speaking. I mean, they literally came out of the Roman society, and they were hired often as mercenaries, and so on. Others were basically settling down and became regularly paid by the Roman army administration and being framed into these regular units, and they could be, either attached to the legions, sometimes even fighting alone. I mean, it really depended. It was very very fluid, as you can imagine. So conceptually, nothing really really weird. The Numeri had this evolution, historically speaking, for which also in here, just the regular auxilia that were settled with the Augustan reform, eventually came to become sort of permanent units over time. I mean, even at the time of Augustus, basically the auxiliaries had been framed into regular units into the Roman army, because at the end of the civil wars, the Romans had recruited this big amount of troops that were, obviously useful and serviceable, and they and it was thought, since the legionaries basically made up the elite, the heavy infantry, and so on, so they had also a specific tactical characterization. The idea of the Roman army was to actually make to frame these barbarian units in, because these were most of the times also the ones who in terms of the practice of warfare sustained the greater amount of they were committed even more than the legionaries. I mean, the legions really intervened where there were these big things like storming a citadel or a pitched battle and so on. But even in this context, it was mostly the auxiliaries that were burdened with the task of actually engaging the enemy more frequently, and in virtue of their tactical ethnic specialties, they were used for other tasks that the legionaries, telling the truth, could even cover. Because if you really look into Roman history, how legionaries were used, they could be very flexible. Theoretically, the Roman legionary was trained for doing a bit everything. It was mostly, if you want to frame the Roman legionary, it was essentially an assault engineer. That's really what a Roman legionary is at the core. But it could do everything. It could be equipped in the most diverse fashions. So there is nothing dogmatic about legionaries being only heavy infantry. But it's obvious that if you have other troops that you can recruit because they come across the border, you can pay them. They're there. They come exactly for fighting, and they're good at what they do as light troops most of the times, like the Numeri were. Why not obtaining them? So the Numeri that we're saying basically came a little bit later. I don't exactly remember where the first Numeri as such are witnessed, historically speaking, but they weren't essentially that different from others, and eventually came to be organized into centuries, and the organic could really vary compared to the irregular ones of the legionary infantry. But that's the real point, that the real function of these troops was their tactical specialization, and that was it. That was basically how it was conceived for. The idea of having the Balearic slingers. Those were good at doing it. They had it in their in their blood, because their society had developed in that way, in that areas, and that's what they were famous for and would be used for. And the point also, there is a convenience into this, because as we've said, the foreigners had further units to basically to be hired, and they were interested into it, so they were also relatively cheap in many ways, and they participated to the Roman army, not just at a parity ground with the Roman citizens, but also for getting something more, and to achieve something, having something to demonstrate, and in order to deserve a proper reward. And if you really look at even at this, already at this in the 2nd century AD, the numerus as such became a sort of permanent unit that were recruited usually at the provincial level and so on. And in the 4th century, you find a huge amount of numeri within the organic of the Roman army that now had basically become sort of units on their own, that had lost that auxiliary connotation and now were essentially something more. They were framed also traditionally. They had a secular history at this point as single units into the Roman army, and even the equipment and the skills at that point of these troops were blended into. They were essentially not much different from the legionnaires, if not, practically the same. Also because legionnaires had at that point undergone a differentiation tactically, but so this is really, I think, whoever is acquainted to the Roman army knows certain things. Now, this, however, had presented a problem essentially on the long run, because these ethnic populations from which these tactical specializations were to be found for being used by the Roman army progressively got gentrified. In a process that make them lose essentially those skills, that characterization, that tactical functionality, and even by this was evident already from the 2nd century in some ways. Telling the truth, there was really no stopping point in the hiring of these mercenaries. It was not of these foreign troops, let's say. The problem now is the relation that they had in terms of, who was who in terms also of the within or outside the Roman borders, and what these, what these troops were, what these individuals were from a political, from a civic point of view, because it's at that point that you have the problem. During the 2nd century, the numeri were being assimilated to the regular auxiliary units, and they essentially were losing not only their technical specialties, but now they were also becoming Roman citizens in large part. So they were now almost completely composed as units by cives or cives, as you want to call them. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So in this same sense, from a linguistical point of view, the same differentiation that the term numerus had represented compared to the other auxiliaries as a military unit came to distinguish itself. So at this point, all of these troops were indifferently called as Militias, so as soldiers, identifying a generic military unit that didn't have probably nothing to do with the old ethnical numeri of the Principate. So this, as we've seen, had gone on with the concession of the Roman citizenship. So from one point it had solved the problem of the legionary recruitment, because these people had basically joined to transform even into a citizenship class, so to be eligible in theory for legionary service. From the other side, there was a sort of reconversion of the pre-existing numeri into the regular units that were similar to the auxiliary and that were Romanized, also in terms of the combat techniques. So there was a problem now that in really finding a way to preserve a recruitment pool, a minimal recruitment pool of troops that were non-Romans, essentially. Also for the way you could basically employ these troops. So this problem is pretty evident, especially from the 3rd, 4th century, because at that point there is a general crisis of manpower. It was pretty transversal. So at that point was not just a matter of finding troops you could essentially throw into the meat grinder without having too many political costs within the empire, but there was a problem now finding even the same legionnaires again, because society was impoverishing itself. There was a endemic contraction. Most of the people, most of the same troops that had made, most of the same citizens that had made it to that point into the Roman society, coming from the auxiliary service, had achieved what they wanted. That is, stop fighting, settle down, getting a farm, becoming the Roman middle class. But at this point, these troops were impoverishing, and also drawing from their ranks was increasingly difficult, because these troops didn't even want to go to war anymore. Gentrification as a factor also in the crisis of recruitment is very important, because at that point it has nothing to do with you really forcefully calling for these people to arms. It's really about also these people not, being a political body that can be adverse to you in many ways. And there were also other problems, because at the same time, certain areas of the empire, especially the ones of ancient Romanization, wanted to maintain a higher degree of control on the political and military matters, while now the frontiers were becoming increasingly more turbulent. So there had to be necessary someone out there who defended the thing, and the ways of recruiting troops were increasingly coming to be unorthodox compared to the other ones, because you want to have a military control, but you don't want to go to war. So this obviously takes you to the recruitment of mercenaries that you can find now within the borders of the empire, because you have basically Romanized almost everything, and this gentrified the whole society in many ways, aside from also impoverishing it in other terms, but let's say framing it in a kind of a non-tribal, non-warlike context. And the only answer is, you have to recruit mercenaries from the outside, from outside the borders, from populations that are non-Romans at this point. So this naturally, as we've seen, also entailed the very strict tactical need of having troops who were specialized with particular equipments or tactics. So these troops were very important to find for winning battles properly, and not just in terms of sheer manpower. That, albeit being the most important thing, was not only about that. So at the beginning of the 3rd century, there was a solution that was found by Caracalla, who basically recurred to the exclusive use of real barbarian warriors that were hired outside the borders, or let's say hiring troops that basically came from barbarian communities, had been settled into the imperial territory, the so-called Dediticii or Dediticii. So the Deditio or Deditio was in Roman law a juridical institution that posed a community called Dedita community that into a sort of transitory normative power of Rome. So this normally used when when a Roman commander had basically seized control of certain communities, and consulting with his own headquarter, basically decided to give back to these conquered communities a sort of autonomy, and this autonomy was eventually formalized, recognized by the Roman statal organisms that had basically to incorporate in a way or another these communities within the imperial domination. So in any way, this Dedita community, albeit at this point being subdued by Rome, was granted usually life and liberty thanks to the concept of fides. So this was very important because aside from the hypocrisy of the concept, so these were naturally communities that remained under the Roman control and so on. There was really no way in the ancient world to police everyone, putting garrisons everywhere. There were certain contexts that were dictated also by the local political balance that made certain communities now siding with Rome as a sort of buffer states or client states that at that point had sworn allegiance to Rome, and in exchange they had to provide troops, among other things, but that in this sense were tied to Rome and to this allegiance. So basically, the Dediticii or Dediticii were non-Romans. They were, in fact, void of any other Roman form of citizenry. You know that the Roman citizenry was at various levels. There were several ranks you could progress into this. So into the Roman Empire, actually was plenty of people who were de facto foreigners, the so-called Peregrini, for instance, that were basically subjects of the empire, but were non-Roman citizens, and they were freemen. So this is also interesting because it tells you how the Roman citizenship was something participative in many ways, so that you obviously as a Roman citizen you had more rights than a Peregrinus, for instance, but at the same time the citizenry was still something that was spreading, that had to be earned. So at the time of Caracalla, this process was famously arrived to a point for which it was very difficult to distinguish now who was a Roman citizen. I mean, in strictly not in strictly juridical terms, but in the practice of politics and society, from someone who was not a Roman citizen. So Caracalla emanated the Constitutio or Constitutio Antoniniana. That was an edict emanated in 212 AD that basically established the concession of the Roman citizenship to all the inhabitants of the empire, with the exception of the Dediticii. So basically, you were, if you spoke Latin, but in practice this meant many things, because at that point almost everyone was a Roman citizen, as long as you knew Latin, because that's really was a kind of one of the few preconditions, and you basically were a Roman citizen. The only problem is now that Roman society was declining, so rather than a Roman citizen, you were becoming essentially a Roman subject. A freeman, but definitely a freeman, but now was sinking in terms of individual bargaining power and political power, and it was basically shrinking to, it was increasing social stratification and difference in, there were always fewer but richer people at the top, and way more and poorer people at the bottom of society. So now things that we can't really scope in the civilian side, and in here, for talking about the Symmacharii or Symmachiarii, finally, we know we have to look at certain sources proper, and that were two contemporaries of Caracalla, Cassius Dio and Herodianus. I don't know how you say that. Wait a second. Herodianus, yes. These sources state that Caracalla, in fact, hired certain warriors that came from the areas of that existed beyond the Rhine and the Danube. So these areas essentially of Central and Eastern Europe, with whom he basically establish a sort of special bodyguard unit that were in Greek called the so-called henotes, if I pronounce correctly, and plus certain units of Symmacharii. So these barbarians basically, according to these sources, were even preferred by the emperor to the Roman regulars, to the regular soldiers, and at this point he also liked to dress into the Germanic fashion, and including that mantle that was called Caracallus. Basically, it gave him the nickname through which he was known into history. And this is kind of interesting because obviously these troops had been recruited, as we've seen, beyond the, say, the limes. So talking about borders for the Roman Empire is quite tricky because, you know, the concept of the border was not really assimilated into the empire. Even the same concept of limes was probably not very much used. If anything, it was the monumentum that was conceived as such. I mean, the properly imperial ideology for which you reinforce a certain garrison somewhere to basically extend your deterrence to many peoples at once. I mean, the idea, for instance, that there was a sort of a German border is completely I mean, it's not completely wrong, because obviously there were certain areas where the Romans controlled and others not. But the idea is, I don't know, all the German legions of Rome that were scattered over the Rhine, for instance, were not there just for, you know, because there was an outside that was represented by the Germans and an inner side represented by the Gauls. You know, those troops were there virtually to keep at bay both people. So this idea that the I don't know, outside of the border where all these guys pushing in the street, it's not truly like that. The borders were extremely fluid. The Romans had been settling these Germanic troops since the very early years, as soon as they arrived on the Rhine. So in here it's really a tricky concept, but it's pretty much obvious that most of the peoples that lived, let's say, outside of what we think of as the Roman borders were also very visibly distinguishable, if anything, for clothes and fighting styles from the Roman soldiers. That, in fact, seemingly according to these sources, weren't really very friendly with this. You know, they didn't like each other very much. And interestingly enough, however, these troops that we have seen, the Enotes and the Symmacharii, remained extraneous to the concession of the citizenship and the framing of their troops into the regular units. So we should, if it is really so, we basically think of the of Caracalla's Symmacharii as certain Peregrini, and therefore necessarily Dediticii or Dediticii, so that were in this sense tied directly to the dynasty of the Severi, and either, let's say, tied to the Severi, either basically belonging to certain groups that were had been subdued by the Romans in previous times, but that were at this point still scarcely integrated into the empire. You know that even, you know, the Roman Empire had a kind of a relatively modern, rational mindset in terms of how everything had to be organized socially. I mean, Roman law is very precise, clear. Its society was framed in a certain way. When it came to deal with this barbarian populations, especially in this case the Germanic populations, there was very much the idea that, I mean, from a German side at least, that there was a sort of individual relation, agreement between the two. I mean, a Germanic tribesman at that point wouldn't conceive his allegiance to the Romans as an allegiance to Rome in itself, but essentially an agreement that was paritarily contracted with the individual, with a single emperor, with a single Caracalla or the Severi dynasty. So this was very convenient, and naturally now it opens to a series of considerations of the different view how culture was seen. But this was, from the Roman side, was relatively profitable, especially at this point, because the Roman emperors were having kind of troubles in also controlling the army in many ways. So hiring these mercenaries, these foreigners, was a way basically to tie them to their personas, and not to the events of the empire. This is really, and to the internal political affairs of the empire. This is something you find all over history. I mean, literally, you find it. Why is there in history many bodyguards were essentially foreigners? Some of the most important greater sovereigns in history had actually they were sovereign on such big kingdoms and empires, and had very powerful armies, etc. National armies, let's say, that they still used foreign troops and foreign mercenaries for their defense, because it was thought, in fact, that these people were extraneous to the local political affairs and schemes, and therefore were kind of more faithful than the others. In fact, as I always say in Schwerpunkt, the myth that the mercenary is somehow unfaithful, or compared to the guy who is recruited from Blut und Boden and like that, is a romantic myth of the 19th century. And before, objectively, usually mercenaries were some of the best troops you could find, and really, if you had the money to pay them, they would be more than faithful, really, at that point. So, it was just a matter of money, but this was not much different from what happened for the other people. Just what this problem what the laws in Roman recruitment were saying. What was the commitment of these elite Roman citizens to join the army? Very, very low. Relatively to this, I made a video some time ago that is fiscal recruitment in the late Roman army, 4th to 5th century. So this is slightly later from, today we will mostly discuss the 3rd century, but that kind of gives you an idea. Also because certain practices were pretty much the same throughout, and certain practices were also revived from previous times, so that gives you an idea also what the resistance to levy, let's say, was within the Roman world, and why sometimes barbarian mercenaries were better even than Roman citizens for fighting. Contrarily wise to what common prejudice and beliefs. So what is particularly interesting is the use of the Greek term Symmacharii and the Latin one Symmacharii or Symmachiarii in the works of two authors of the 2nd century, that is the Pseudo-Hyginus and Arrian. The Pseudo-Hyginus names them essentially twice, and the together with the nationes or nationes. In fact, it says Symmacharii et relique nationes. So, but distinguishing by them the excuse me, I was distinguishing the Symmacharii from the nationes. So this is interesting because basically certain authors came up saying, well, but then the Symmacharii were substantially different in some way from the Numeri / nationes. Oh, by the way, we didn't say what nationes were essentially the natio was essentially, now it would be roughly translatable like nation, but obviously has a very different, very difficult very difficult meaning, because basically the natio in Latin means essentially where you were born. Mm. So this basically was a term that individuated certain common characters that tied certain individuals at the point of transforming them into peoples. So this was, however, at the time, in relation to the, especially to these foreign troops and the Numeri, a way to say, okay, these are foreigners, because they were conceived as nations. I mean, other nations. So this, pretty turbulent now group of peoples that existed outside the empire and were seen still as something on their own, whereas within the empire now, as we've seen, everything was getting pretty much more homogeneous, or at least there weren't certain individual nations that kind of behaved like a thing on their own, although definitely at a provincial scale that there were so many differences in languages and customs and so on, as you understand. So the distinction between Symmacharii and Numeri / Nationes was that basically the Symmacharii do not seem, in the sense, to have been as regulars, as I've seen, into the Roman army, but they were kind of new heterogeneous groups that maybe could comprehend even other, that could be really mixed in origin. For instance, they could comprehend local militias, provincial militias, temporary allies, or even prisoners of wars that had passed to the Romans, mercenaries, and even contingents that were imposed to the defeated enemies. Interestingly enough, at the time of Alexander Severus and Maximinus the Thracian, it was mostly, these troops were mostly coming from the very borders of the empire, from the Mauri in North Africa, the Osranians would be essentially I think it's already the Fertile Crescent, it's Syria basically, and the Armenians, and even among from the Parthians, there were either deserters or prisoners that were enticed by the pays, by the salaries, and joined into the Roman army. So there is also this passage from another passage from the Pseudo-Hyginus that states from which this Symmacharii seem to be actually an even wider category that comes to encompass even the same nationes. So basically, from his we derived that at least at the time there was no real sharp, clear difference between the two typologies. This is very important in general, because when you read Roman sources from that period, or the ancient world in general, you have to think that these terms weren't really categorized in a scientific fashion. It was not like, there was no enlightenment encyclopedical categorization at that time. Different words were used with a much wider semantic shading than we imagine. It's really it's way more interesting to look at the etymology of the term. Much more useful in order to understand the real meaning of it. The same term Symmacharii, as we've seen before at the beginning, would be, and this is my idea, that they were a sort of generic friendly unit that, however, probably, and in my opinion, was coming mostly from this, in fact, friends of Rome, not just troops that came from somewhere by chance, but there were troops that had signed a sort of, coming from communities that had a sort of sympathy or cooperation or alliance with Rome proper. So not just, you have to think of course, the world outside the Roman Empire was quite fragmented, also politically speaking. So it's difficult at this point even to say who's who. at this point. I mean, because even a small tribe could have, and we've lost track of most of these relations with the empire, could have in fact, a bond with the empire. And dealing with it especially at a local level, the provincial governors would be naturally very, very much into what the political situation was outside, the limits and so on. They would exploit this. This was perfectly normal at all times. But this, in fact, even comes to encompass the same concept of nation. So therefore, this seems to even extend this narrow definition that I tried to give now, and it's relatively confused. So this diversified and yet not well defined nature of the Symmacharii is also evident in Arrian. So he uses in Greek the substantive oi symmakoi, and also the substantivation oi symmakoi, and also the collective to symmaki kon, if I'm not wrong. So this basically in both these statements, the author refers always to non-regular troops that were aggregated to the army that the same author, when Arrian was governor of Cappadocia under Hadrian, had led against a band of invading Alans around 135 AD. So from the Symmachoi that are listed, from the different typologies that are listed among the Symmachoi listed by Hadrian, we can spot essentially two different. In fact, we can spot two different typologies. The first one is essentially local militias that were made up by soldiers coming from Minor Armenia Minor, and Trapezus and Ritius, that were essentially two cities that were comprehended into the Roman province of Cappadocia, or Cappadocia, as you want to call it. The second typology is troops from the Colchis. There should be roughly today's western Georgia on the Black Sea. That therefore at the time was an external region from the empire. It was still close to it because Rome definitely controlled both Asia Minor and the Black Sea at that point, so it was still in some kind of relation of influence with the empire. But that made up essentially that was just across the northeastern border of the province of Cappadocia, or Cappadocia. So talking specifically about this last kingdom of Colchis, so talking about these regions of Iberia and the Bosphorus, we know that Trajan, for instance, just before the on the eve of his Parthian campaign, states, I don't remember where this thing is taken from, but there is a Latin source that says Iberos Bosphorianos Colchos infidem Romanae Dicionis recepit. Or also, if you want, Iberos Bosphorianos Colchos infidem Romanae Dicionis recepit. So basically, this means that these populations that lived around those areas were received in Deditio by Trajan at that point. So basically, Trajan recognized the kings of these regions as vassals of Rome, and this lexicon is being used would be in fact maybe not properly a deditio, but something very similar, as an act of formal submission. So this is naturally shaded because, as you imagine, this addition to Rome, this I don't know where you can find an anglicized term. dedication, that would be essentially to Rome, was very it was a formal act. I mean, sometimes we think that diplomacy was at this point just a, something also here heavily categorized from I don't know, if a guy was amicus populi Romani, you think as if there was all a process that brought to acknowledge this friendship in a formalized, identical way that you can compare them. Actually, no, because every political relation was different. So even the submission of to Rome was sometimes something more or less meaningful for these populations, because it naturally entailed an obedience that could not always remain in the same way. So naturally the Romans especially were stressing in their sources, that are also the ones that essentially let us know what these peoples were at the time, mostly. Were stressing the fact that these, all these different kings had submitted to the power of the empire in some way, so that they were looking at it in a, also expressing that in a propagandistic fashion that naturally was hiding a much more shaded and much more fluid situation. Nevertheless, it is important to stress all the various bonds that existed in the sense between the friends of the Roman people. That is something that also sounds pretty much like close eventually to the Greek Symmacharii or the Latin Federati. So these were troops, in that case, in the Parthian campaign, Trajan's Parthian campaign, was aimed at not just securing the borders, obviously, because these peoples now were important also to maintain the supply lines kind of safe without certain betrayals and so on, but also providing troops that were used in this sense also basically to disarm them, so keeping these troops within the Roman army during the expedition, but also to use them as sort of hostages in part. So obviously also the nobility. Now, what was this foreign nobility was participating to this expedition, so it was a very complex net of relationships that also allowed especially the nobility, the youngers, etc., this foreign nobility to be assimilated, to be co-opted by Rome, and to see the benefits that they could derive from a cooperation with the empire. So even in the 4th century, you still find this examples of capitulation that, even if it's not expressly defined as deditio or deditio, didn't basically bring to the acquisition of territory from the side of the empire, nor the deportation of the population, but just the duty of providing recruits or supplies, and also accepting in broader terms the interference of the Roman Emperor into for instance, in the appointment of the local sovereign, and something like that. And there are so many examples of that. With several populations like the Franks, the Alemanni, the Sarmatians, the Saxons, the Quadi, and so on, that there is even a very hot debate actually in how these relations developed into history, because the Roman Empire lasted renowningly for a long time, so even the relations with different peoples followed a praxis that kind of evolved even from the Republican time to late imperial one, and it seems that especially in imperial times there is a sort of continuity in the juridical interpretation of the deditio in fidem or deditio in fidem. Basically, it was a unconditioned surrender of a population that was external to the empire after a defeat on the field, or even by just a simple request from Rome to basically render the Romans masters of people and goods that belonged to that same population. This is what is stated by Livy in several passages. But this eventually would not bring to the to annihilation of the existence of the individuals of these populations, because after the act of the dedication of the Deditio, the empire usually opted for the rendition of the territory to the defeated, or to this population, whatever the relations were, in a fashion that now was basically granted by Rome. So the idea that it was the Romans who had decided not to annihilate you and to give you back a certain of autonomy that was expressed by a fidus or foidus, a non-paritary fidus foidus, because this the Romans established this federa that are nothing but the alliances, basically, of foedera, as you wanna. It sounds bad sometimes in restituta pronunciation, but I try to always state the two, both terms, that usually entailed that there was an equal alliance and an unequal alliance. So the equal alliance was basically a paritary relation between Rome and other populations. The unequal one, which usually also brought to the incorporation of the empire, of these populations in the empire, especially in the beginning when Rome was on the rise, it entailed a military contribution in men and or supplies in exchange from imperial subsidies. So basically Rome would rarely at that point bring to complete slavery the world population. It mostly was useless. It really depended on the strategical interest that Rome had. I mean, the Rome. I mean, if you look at when Caesar invaded Gaul, Caesar at a certain point subdues certain tribes that maybe had been rebellious, but he lets them dwell into certain areas. Then he subdued other populations that had been faithful to Rome, and he literally wipes them out. And you realize that this choice was based on what was the political balance, locally speaking. I mean, even if there was someone who had been fighting against you, but now you needed it because it was, I don't know, a buffer state that counterbalanced the influence of another one that bordered, they could stay, whereas certain other populations were maybe rich or that were too dangerous in certain areas, just wipe them out and get this is realpolitik, by the way. However, it seems because also we can't really read this quite clearly that the federati, so the allied peoples, were always in the first place some sort of Dediticii or Deditici, at least up to the time of Aldericus in the fifth century, because also in here Rome had a greater bargaining power than most of these populations. So that was the discriminant factor, if you really want. And going back to the Arians' categorization, the submission of the Colchis and the other two Caucasian kingdoms was even represented into certain coins, on a series of coins, with the very eloquent line, the very eloquent legend, regna ad signata, which is very, very, very eloquent, because it basically means nothing but kingdoms were assigned or assigned to actually same sovereigns. So by Rome, that had kind of first taken them and then given them back in theory. So this was very important also for many religious point of view. I mean, the idea of having been a subdued population really arrived even even if only from a formal juridical praxis, so that it's not that Rome had really conquered those kingdoms, but the idea that these were accepted to have been essentially brought under Rome and then being given back their autonomy, basically sanctioned that they had renounced to their freedom. That was probably the most praised, the most the most important thing at the time. And this basically sanctioned from, it's as if it had been a kind of a military victory over these populations. And therefore the conqueror now could say, it's me who makes you reign in there, because you gave your kingdom to me initially, and then I gave it back to you. So if you go against the fides, because pacta sunt servanda, you basically commit a sacrilege of some sort. So you basically will have the gods punishing you. And naturally, many of these kingdoms that were actually pretty small ones, the Caucasian ones were not a big deal actually. The biggest one was Armenia, and as you know, Armenia went back and forth from the Romans to the Persians several times as a buffer state. But this had no interest basically to oppose the Romans. I mean, most of these kingdoms really had no hope to withstand the power of Rome. First of all, because even before the fear of being razed to the ground by the Roman legions, to whom they really couldn't resist given their manpower and resources. The problem is that these kingdoms were already within the system of Roman trade, and therefore getting to war with the empire would have crushed them economically even before the actual military operations would have begun. So it's not they had much of an option in many ways. So there is this beautiful picture of a here you see it's Sestertius from 114 and 117 AD, that shows Trajan sitting on a tribunal. So this basically this stage, how you want to call it, it's the same. It's the same word from which the English tribunal actually comes from. So this would be the stand, a platform, a sort of podium, how you want to call it, that is elevated over the other three kings that basically render an homage, standing, and who also seem to be receiving the symbols of royal power from the hands of the same Trajan. So it's pretty eloquent. It's naturally a propagandistic picture, but nevertheless it was something that circulated, if anything. So we're celebrating the submission of these populations to Rome. Also, Procopius later writes that in Antonine times there was a sort of the Trajan basically installed certain detachments of the Roman military into the Colchis. So this dependence of the Colchis from Rome seems to be confirmed, and therefore it's possible, especially that and even Arian states actually that there were small Roman garrisons that were deployed around the mouth of the river Fasi, and in Sebastopolis, that would be Suhumi, modern Suhumis, but in Adrian times. And there's also other archaeological finds that seem to confirm this, basically. So, getting back to the point, Harian gives us these two typologies of the Symmachoi that seem to be, in this sense, local garrisons from Cappadocia that wasn't particularly Romanized. Cappadocia would be the hinterland of Asia Minor, practically, and also, at this point, controlling also parts of the Black Sea, of the northern Turkish shores. But it was relatively external. It was kind of an eastern, and relatively few. The major Roman centers were essentially in the west of Asia Minor and mostly on the coasts. But so the local militias, the provincial militias, could be considered as something a bit external, not really like part of the empire proper, but sort of friendlies of allies that were there that served. Because throughout all the Roman Empire, there weren't just the Roman legionaries. I mean, every population, every community had its own local militias, their own local garrisons, that were nothing naturally but some kind of police. Obviously, they weren't anything excessively developed, but up to a certain point, because the Romans used partly these militias even in certain military operations. But naturally, the Romans tended to disarm. They tended to disarm these militias at the point that it would be useless for them even to attempt to face the Roman legions in any context, especially in open field. So either these troops that instead came from from properly foreign countries like the ones of the Colchis, and that had been submitted to Rome, however, as client states. So from Arrian, we get that these Symmachoi not only were distinguished from the legions and the auxilia, but perhaps in a less evident way from the same nationes. Why? Because for instance, if you look at there is a sort of list, for instance, of the military forces that were present in Cappadocia towards the end of the Hadrian's reign, and there is no trace apparently of the Numeri. So these troops that were recruited even locally in that province didn't seem to have been to be equal to the Numeri, for instance. And besides, we noticed that the ethnicities and the civitates or civitates that are named by Harian do not figure in the list of the nationes that of the Pseudo-Hyginus, nor in the Numeri that are identified into the diplomatic and epigraphical sources, for which probably, even though we don't really know, the Symmachoi made probably a very different, a sort of different typology, or at least a partially different typology from them. There is also other evidence. For instance, the only inscription in the Roman world that explicitly names the Symmachiarii is relative to the Astures in Trajan times. So the Asturians that were never recorded elsewhere as belonging to a numerus, interestingly enough. So the allies, and there is also another very important point, is that the allies quoted by Arrian, listed by Arrian, comprehend also the Oplitai, which is a term that is usually meant to be heavy infantry at this point. So it's like the ancient hoplites, but even though hoplite warfare had basically now kind of vanished, but in the essentials, the hoplite, which is this heavy infantry with shields and spears, that's basically the average militia you can find everywhere. That in fact, however, was a heavier equipment than the one used by the Numeri, because the hoplite they weren't really such extremely picked troops at this point into the Roman army, but they were, however, still heavier than the lighter troops that usually characterized the Numeri as light, especially light cavalrymen, light skirmishers that were different from the hoplites conceptually to the Roman sources at this point. So this is a series of hints that would apparently show that there is a substantial difference between the Symmacharii and the Numeri/Nationes. So there have been certain authors at this point that, on this basis, that observed, that thought that essentially the Symmacharii were these traditional contingents of allies, that is the federati, as I was saying before, that existed since ever practically, and that are listed even in the Julio-Claudian period, whereas the Nationes would make up a sort of a new type of units of subgroup of some sort that had been created only in later times as a consequence of a sort of new political deportation of the Dediticii, of the barbarian Dediticii, that had begun in some marginal way between the 1st and the 2nd century AD and become essentially systematic between the 2nd and the 3rd century AD. So, according to this interpretation, basically the Dediticii would be identified with a part of the Numeri, that is the Nationes. There is a problem though, because this equivalence is not so evident, because probably the term Symmacharii was evolving from also as a terminology to define generically the allied troops of every type that comprehended the Dediticii. That was distinguishing progressively from the Numeri. And by the time of Herodian and Cassius Dio, hence after the Edict of Caracalla, basically these Symmacharii would be nothing but the Dediticii, as far as we know. So complete foreigners at this time were not even partly integrated into the Roman Empire in some way and being part of the regular army, but populations might have dwelled already within the empire, but had not been fully Romanized. So on the other hand, however, now perhaps it gets a bit complicated, and maybe it's just confusing, but however, this is important. This is importantly clear, is that basically the Nationes basically were equivalent to the Numeri. So if you think that the Symmacharii could comprehend in part also the Nationes, so being populations that in this sense were even semantically, because Nationes is more generic than Numeri in many ways. I mean, it really stresses something that goes beyond the military organization in some ways. So Between the Numeri and the Symmachiarii, there would be the fundamental difference that the Numeri were already framed into the Roman army in some way, by even traditionally and even from certain specific peoples. Because, while the Symmacharii would be something completely new at this point, and I don't know how sense it makes, because at this point, by the way, the Numeri were usually recruited only from certain, mostly from certain populations that were growing habitually dependent on Rome. At this point, as we've seen, there were several populations that were praised since the very early age for their combat skills, were integrated into the Roman army. At this point in the 3rd century, however, there is a great movement of troops, especially in Central Europe, for which you realize a movement of peoples, of nationes, if you want, that the Romans had known previously but had not quite come in contact with, especially when they came from the depths of the Barbaricum. They had not quite bordered the limes. So this Symmacharii might be indeed something that came from as a new typology of barbarian troops that were introduced specifically by Caracalla in his Imperial Guard. This could be really a new interpretation, because it's this term of Symmachos that really makes you reflect, because this means that the friendly with someone who had contracted a sort of alliance that was not even completely a real submission. It was something more. It was a sort of bond, of a relationship, even parody in some way. So if Caracalla had adopted these troops in his own guard, this would make them obviously sort of privileged units that weren't there not as a simple traditional relation from certain populations of the empire and its military organization. These now were personal troops of the sovereign. So this interpretation, I think, is very interesting, because it looks at a bit more in depth at what these relations could be. And unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't know even about numbers of the Symmacharii or Symmachiarii, because that would explain much. And in my opinion, however, we can't stop the Symmacharii just to Caracalla's bodyguard. And if you think about the fluidity also of the now emperors started to last very few. There was much internal turmoil in the empire and on the frontiers. So naturally, the relations between even the populations that provided these troops and the single emperors were quite discontinuous, as you can imagine. So this might be just a tiny part of maybe of the Roman military organization at that point that we know about as a term that made us question what it really means, but not having been something so systematical as we imagine. So conceptually, it would be, however, Numeri / Nationes from one side and Symmachoi / Dediticii from the other one. And the fact that we get to know this from Caracalla in many ways, in this more individual relation, it's very meaningful, because you see from the previous sources that we quoted, these troops were already known as such from the 2nd century. But now in the 3rd century, after the Constitutio Antoniniana, you have the same emperor that emanated that edict hiring troops who were completely foreigner, and were therefore also easily distinguishable from what existed within the imperial borders, within imperial boundaries. So this is really meaningful, and it could represent a sort of further stage, of opening and increasing interaction, let's say, with populations that up to that point had not been properly part of the Roman Empire. Also, very important in here is that to remember that the Numeri were already largely made up by Roman citizens at this point, whereas these other troops, the Dediticii, were of non-Roman juridical status, therefore were excluded from the civitas, or the civitas as you want to call it. So, and there is, however, one interesting evidence, historical evidence we have, because there is a unique uniquely distinguished unit that appears clearly from the Roman classification, from the Roman nomenclature, if you want, as a sort of Dediticii unit that dates exactly at the time of the Severi, and we're talking about the unit named Britones Dediticii, that are that interestingly enough they are witnessed from an inscription coming from Valdurn, so in the limes of the from the limes of Germania Superior, so in actually in the heart of Europe. And this unit brought also the nickname of Alexandriani, because this was in fact the inscription is to 232 AD. So these were basically troops that maybe had been submitted through the Deditio during the campaign of Septimius Severus between 209-211 AD. That is basically a couple of years before the Edict of Caracalla. So basically these were troops that the Romans subjugated in Britain, and that were in fact dedicated in this sense. I mean, they were called properly Britones, so Britons Dediticii, so being submitted in this fashion, and nicknamed as it was normal at the time, especially for anyone who basically entered into the Roman system either as a citizen or as not, as Alexandriani, so gaining this the patronym, kind of the and of the imperial of the current emperor. So this is the quite explicit evidence of the Dediticii in this sense, even though creation and eventual even deportations or relocation, if you prefer, of certain barbarian units that had been previously defeated are also witnessed by the same Cassius Dio only for the 2nd century. So this could show that recurring to certain units was something relatively new, and this was basically adding up in a new strategical context in which the frontiers had come to be turbulent once again. In this sense, distinguishing these troops from the older Numeri that had gone essentially on the path of regularization within the Roman army. So this would show basically a development that lasted for decades, and so already from the times of Arrian and the Pseudo-Hyginus, from several times. So it's really the a long term process that eventually brought to the more consistent integration of elements that were that had nothing to do with the traditional sources of recruitment of the Roman army, at least when you look at the individual peoples that were being part of this unit. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So perhaps, even if you look at the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, you might think that this edict was partly, of course, for all the other reasons that are very meaningful, but from the military point of view, this had been oriented to even safeguard the ethnical composition of such units. Because if you really draw a sharp division between those who are now Roman citizens all over the empire, practically with the edict, and those who are outside of it, more or less physically meant, you might, you could really create a kind of better distinction, and therefore kind of fueling this mechanism, juridical mechanism of the Deditio, that could keep to provide to the empire these units of Peregrini that were specialized in particular combat styles, and to which, for which basically Romanizing them would have equated to lose these characteristics. I know it's a bit of a push theory, because I don't know if you got the concept. I'm expressing myself very poorly now, but the point is this: if you allow these people to Romanize, what you do is essentially you lose the tactical specialty that, as it happened with the Numeri, for instance. Instead, if you maintain them with this kind of status and you sharply define who is a Roman within the borders, who is outside, you can kind of keep them more easily identifiable as someone who is meant to do just that. So this stresses also the probably a transformation from, the increasing availability of mercenaries that had to remain mercenaries in a certain sense, and that at this point, the Romans were keeping to integrate foreign peoples within their borders, but the problem was also to maintain enough troops that could be constantly warlike, and that not necessarily were so they were so happy to receive basically these populations in there. So this is very important, because there is also a contrast at this time between the naturally the Roman populations and these external individuals, so that still the system was conceived as, these are externals, there's our barbarians, of course we can integrate part of them but not all of them, and now they're actually invading us, because this was starting into the 3rd century. So even if the Romans never stopped to do it, but there was by itself an increasing distinction between the outsiders, the insiders in many ways, and this could be exploited even at an army level, in a fashion that basically was even more was functional to the same effectiveness of the army. Excuse me, I'm reading something else, so we got distracted. So according to other authors, this equated also to something better defined as sort of a, the idea is that this Symmacharii slash Symmacharii were becoming elite troops. Since in the Guard of Caracalla you find already these enotes that are, however, different from the Symmacharii in the writing, that were part indeed of this kind of picked troop of the bodyguards. So the idea here is not that rather than being elite the term elite is very relative, of course, but The idea is that if you want certain mercenaries that essentially do that same thing, you're implicitly saying that you want to use these guys as troops that you can rely on, that have this tactical specialization, that have that sort of effectiveness, and that at the end of the day is going to make up only the guys you can practically rely on the field. This is very important because, especially in conditions of continuous warfare, and where also the lack of manpower is starting to be a thing, having these troops that you can basically rely directly from the front, if you want, so from those areas where you're receiving troubles from, is very important. Aside from the political relations that you can weave naturally with the local chieftains and trying to control them and so on, and because you still have the legions in part, so you can exercise even certain pressure. You have troops that basically are constantly fit in terms of a military quality, in terms of its average. I mean, the idea is you use them in the practice, and in the practice you need tough troops, especially in those areas. So these were not probably troops that had to be also integrated. This had to remain non-Roman citizens because they were also not meant to be part of society. It's as if at this point during the 3rd century was a big frontier that was transforming itself into a military frontier practice, and even integrating these populations within was not really a point. If you have these troops, it wasn't just a matter of integrating them into the whole system of the empire like it had been before. I mean, using the Numeri in a moment in which the empire was, albeit already extended, still consolidating, and required the assimilation of the local tribes that you had just conquered. These were just troops that were fighting on the borders practically and needed that kind of military quality to cope with the threats with the enemies, and that naturally were also similar to them, so they were also kind of the best troops that it would take for countering that enemies. So this is a particular case of that you find also many other times, for which the rise of mercenaries and of other troops that are not part of the regular army does not really correspond to a decline of the military, but rather to a contingent necessity that in part definitely exonerates other part of the military. We have seen that the other Roman troops didn't like this very much, but at the same time corresponded to a political and military practice that was actually more functional for an effective management of the frontier and for meeting the threats that were coming out of it. So this is the general picture that I think has to do with this. And there is probably also some relation that existed with this Symmacharii with, they were mostly also political. I mean, these troops could be objectively troops that were sent even by certain tribes or kingdoms to into the Roman ranks, but it was plenty also probably mercenaries of bands of free trade. Also considering the Germanic world at this time was nothing but unitary from a political point of view, so it was full actually in Germanic society of different units that were hired from here and there. I mean, you find even these wolfsmen that were hired at the time of Trajan, if I'm not wrong, from the Danubian border. So these troops, this comitatus basically, that were kind of normal in tribal environments especially, and that now were also probably re-expanding as a phenomenon, because when these populations were to be put in motion, there was a lot of also dynamism of entrepreneurially of I don't know what I'm saying right now, but I mean this world was re-expanding. The frontier had become more turbulent. There were peoples that were starting to get on the march. So there was an increasing militarization and also better organization from those times onwards. So that's why also probably at the time of Trajan you could have these smaller bands, whereas at the time of Caracalla you had probably still those small bands that always remained at the base of Germanic mercenaries, for instance, but they were kind of even more organized and even better acquainted to the Roman military, also and especially because they were now servicing into it. In fact, if you read Herodianus in already by 238 AD, the imperial mobile armies already comprehended a considerable number of Germanic troops, besides other units of cataphracts, Maori, and Eastern archers. That is something that were existing into the among the original, had been part of the original Numeri in part, and that were now joining again, as we have seen from different directions. So if you look at Gordianus III into Aurelianus, they also brought together with them famously large bodies of Alemanni and Goths that were populations that actually they had defeated in battle. So there were definitely the Dediticii that these Roman emperors / generals, because that's what they were, had basically won, but because of the shortage of manpower and for the inherent intrinsic quality of these fighters, were now joining. Also, they were hired into the Roman army and were actually good soldiers. So even in this, the Roman Empire at this time was still able to cope with external threats. I mean, it's not before Adrianople basically that you have an entire people that basically starts to roam within the imperial borders, uncontrolled, unchecked. Of course, the 3rd century was a moment of great disruption. It's thanks to the Illyrian emperors if the empire went on to live on, because it could objectively collapse also in the 3rd century because of all these invasions. But at the same time, there is also a positive dimension of this, in the measure in which the continuous practice of warfare also brought naturally the integration of these elements into the army, because they really served. There were people who were used to fight, who had also in here, who fought for money, of course, but in this sense, this money also in terms of political and social organization of the Roman Empire could be drawn from the subjects of the empire that didn't want to go to war, because they didn't want to be recruited anymore. It was economically inconvenient. Just preferred to pay, so that the emperors could basically pay these troops and in turn and to fight with them. Naturally, the whole picture was much darker, also because there was a lot of civil strife within the same empire. Generals fighting each other, seeing Roman citizenry, being disintegrated in its fabric at this point because of this continuous prolonged warfare and so on. Forced recruitment that definitely still kept happening within the imperial frontiers, but the the military practice was kind of rewarding these mercenary troops that were objectively the best the Romans could use at this point. And still, the Roman army was a perfect Romanizer. I mean, most of these troops over time, in a way or another, however, entered to be part of the system. So even if, initially there was this distinction, eventually the Romans famously began to settle, especially after the 3rd century, entire populations within the imperial boundaries, because at that point these were people who could be transformed into peasants, into farmers, and so on. This was basically what the whole 4th century, 4th, 5th century imperial propaganda was telling. That basically the emperor had not only defeated the barbarians, but had been merciful, and instead of slaughtering them all, had basically civilized them and transformed them into peasants and farmers, etc., So read subjects that had to pay taxes and to give every once in a while even a certain recruit to the army. So that was it. But aside from the general hypocrisies that you can find everywhere in history, in every population, even among this, I recommend you, of course, the Germanic populations at this point, with these leaders who were trying to basically prevaricate one another. These populations were slaughtering one another, so it was terrible also from the other side. But it's nevertheless very interesting, because here we see the rise of even of an internal hierarchy among these foreign troops. Because, for instance, the most famous barbarian chieftains could already, at this time, perhaps in the 3rd century, lead in battle the units of their own connationals, practically. For instance, there is the Aurelian chieftain Nauballatus under Gallienus, or the Frankish Pompeianus in 272 AD. There are an evident picture of this, because, and this stresses the idea that these weren't just tiny units of troops that were completely undetached from any form of political and social organization, but they were probably also troops that were left to organize by themselves in a certain way, because the ethnical discriminant in here was not otherwise explainable, because even if these had been objectively all small bands of foreigners, let's say of Germans, and it's not that the Romans were that thrilled to put a Germanic commander on them just because, these people spoke kind of the same language, or they looked kind of the same. Because, these soldiers could be relatively easily framed at this point also into a Roman discipline, into a bit of Latin phrasery for the army and so on. So that was not the point. But the point was that also probably there was someone from the other side, so in Germany and Central Europe, that was making a living out of mercenarism. This is really the point. So there were internal bonds between units that naturally, that there was a kind of ethnical connection between them, but it was probably much looser than we imagine. It was really the structuration of mercenarism into Roman service from the German side that really was making the thing now. Interestingly enough, and also naturally enough, I would say that the Numeri didn't disappear, because, as we've said, these had been regularized as sort of units on their own, and now they were growing to be very similar also in terms of esprit de corps and in military traditions and organization to the other units of the Roman army. The Numeri usually, however, maintained their own ethnonym, for which we still have even some epigraphical evidence from, I think, still for the 3rd century, and even although more sporadically, even for the up to the 4th and 5th century. So what was happening here really is a new way of looking at the barbarian units, the barbarian troops, and to look at these troops not just because they were foreigner, but because they were specialized in warfare in many ways, commanded usually by Roman officers, but not framed within the regular army, and on the contrary, encouraged to maintain in part alive their military traditions. So this is definitely important, because it all started a bit at this point, especially the idea that the Roman army got kind of barbarized, but this is not really true. It was the same Roman army that was absorbing these units because they simply needed them effectively, and objectively, if you look at it in perspective of Roman history, what you see is that rarely, basically, the Romans had some troubles at a certain point, especially after Adrianople, keeping the numbers of the enemy, of the barbarian elements down, and it's because they obviously these were still a problem. I mean, we know that discipline was not very high among these Germanic populations, etc., because they were not used to it. But over time, and this was a problem when there were these massive injections of barbarians all at once. But if, for all that was a kind of an exception, because throughout all the rest of Roman history, these barbarians were never quite at all, causing problems in that sense. On the contrary, it was not the Roman army to be barbarized in turn, but rather the barbarians to be Romanized through the army. I mean, the Roman army was the most powerful mean of Romanization in late antiquity than anything else. And really, the collapse of the empire has to be read, aside from the internal strife and general environmental conditions were deteriorating and so on, shortage of manpower, economical crisis, and so on, has to be intended, in fact, rather in the moment in which the Roman state doesn't function anymore, not because it had been filled with barbarians, but because the resources had been exhausted. I mean, the internal resources had been exhausted. You can say, well, yeah, of course, because there were enemies at the frontiers. Yeah, of course, sure, as well. I'm not saying that the barbarians didn't have, any fault into this, but I would just like to point out that as long as there was a Roman state, the military standards have always remained dramatically high. And if they didn't, like for instance in the West, in a certain point, it was because there was a general lack in manpower, in resources to invest into there for the state as such. And the state at this time was the army. Let's be honest about it. The greatest expenses, the large majority, the vast majority of the Roman state expenses were about the military, like essentially every other power in the ancient world. I mean, bureaucracy that even at this time was kind of being strengthened, etc., was nothing in terms of expenses compared to military. And so what happened at a certain point is that the Romans couldn't hold anymore this sea tide of peoples, especially as it happened in Gaul at the beginning of the 5th century, because they didn't have manpower on their own. So at that point was not really, the barbarians had been too much integrated. No, it's simply that there was no Roman army there to block anyone, and these guys just poured in. And actually, if you look at it in perspective, if you go into the migration era playlist, this is pretty evident in many ways, because I made many videos about that. The Romans even made these populations federati, allies of Rome, because theoretically the Romans maintained and think about, the Franks in Gaul. I mean, the idea that those were Roman lands, and there was a very strong interaction between these two populations. And even in early medieval times, even the Byzantine Empire had shrunk in terms of sites, etc. Everybody knew that was the empire, and it was technically enough powerful to reconquer vast areas. And therefore, especially up to the 6th century, this was very, very evident. Just think about Justinian's reconquest and so on. So it's not really about the quality of the military, but rather the strength of the availability of resources that eventually brought the empire down. So with the Symmacharii, probably this was beginning, and it was beginning in a very functional way. Also because it was deliberately, it wasn't probably not even a choice up to a certain point. At least not a choice if you look at what the political and social balance within the Roman Empire really had been. So it was a kind of a unavoidable choice in many ways. And these records eventually were going to be, relatively fine. naturally especially a great command, a solid political and military commander at this point, like a successful emperor was usually a general, especially in the 3rd century, really equated that, where there is a strong authority, everybody behaves well. So it's not really a matter, because there were many rebellions that brought, I don't know, Maximinus the Trajan was killed, for instance, by his own troops. I mean, this happened all the time. Really, it was these troops and maybe appointing generals and so on. But this simply happened because certain generals at this point were emerging as kind of a avventuré, rather than actual, rulers, more absolute rulers that like they would grow from the time of Aurelianus, Diocletian, Constantine, and so on. Because at this point there was even a fragmentation within the same Roman society. I mean, some of these emperors were now doing this, recruiting troops from the borders because they wanted to make coup d'état in Rome, especially in the 3rd century. So this inherently brought them to rely on those barbarians to the frontiers, because maybe the military, or at least part of it, was not siding with them. They needed this manpower, and at that point it was themselves putting themselves into the condition of depending on these foreign troops and eventually getting killed. But it's not really a decline in itself. It's really, a decline that was dictated by internal factors into the Roman society and Roman politics, and not really because these troops really did much of harm at this point. Also because, they didn't make it to objectively to conquer anything at this point. They didn't have manpower. At this point, during the 3rd century, there were these large invasions that, however, were aimed at essentially at pillaging and then coming back home. There was no way these populations could basically occupy the Roman soil permanently and hope to get away with it, considering what the state of the Roman military still was practically. And as I was saying before, it's not before Adrianople, at the end of the 4th century, that this would become practically a problem. And that was also the fate of just one battle. That shows naturally how at this point also demographics was important in some ways. But hey, after generations, the Romans were once again slaughtering by each other, fielding much larger armies than the imperial and the Gothic one at Adrianople combined on their own. So what kind of decline was in there, really? There was not. And for instance, if Adrianople had been won by the Romans, maybe today we won't be talking about certain things. History would have gone radically different in some ways. But even if you look at the same Adrianople, this eventually didn't bring by itself to the decline of the empire. Because, if you take Stilicho, he basically played like cat and mice with Alaricus. At that point, you could wipe him out for 3 times, and he decided not to do it because he thought he could, benefit from his permanence and so on. So, really, the decline is not even tied now to an injection of these barbarian recruits, who, over time, would, on the contrary, grow essentially dependent from this business with Rome, especially talking about the Germans, because one thing you talk about the Huns, who objectively had no way to be assimilated into the Roman Empire, if not in tiny groups objectively. Of course, there was plenty of Hunnic mercenaries, but what I'm saying is that, the Huns were nomads. They couldn't really convert to Roman sedentarism. While the Germans were kind of semi-sedentary at this point, that they were looking at Rome and saying, okay, I like this. I want to be part of it. I don't want to destroy it. On the contrary, I want to preserve it because I understand the benefits that arrive from this lifestyle. I want to share them, essentially. Then, naturally, also the Germans had their own limits, but they still objectively tried to eventually to rule the Roman territories on the wake of the Roman administration with support of the local population. There was no other way that this could happen objectively. but just for saying that even for the Huns, it's not that Attila even ever wanted to destroy the empire, because destroying the empire would have equated to have fragmented it in so many different chunks that would be to be convinced one by one, even with force of arms. Whereas, well, where the empire was still intact, you could crop it as a cow by asking for tributes, and this could arrive only through a functional system that could provide that money. So, and at that time, it had been really the political practice, even from the Romans, to pay, actually, instead than going to war, which was immensely more expensive. And at this point, especially when Rome was largely on the defensive, also quite useless to do, because where do you want to expand into the Barbaricum? That's not the point. You prefer just to fence these guys off and to preserve and to consolidate within your borders. And this worked into the east. Well, into the west we know how it's gone, but even in the west, if you look at it in perspective, the decline was pretty much transversal. I mean, even when if you look at the end of the 5th century, for instance, up to Majorianus, objectively the west might have survived. I mean, if the if the Vandals had not, had lost even just one battle, Italy could quite easily retake Spain. The Visigoths had already said, okay, we surrender. So there were still the resources to do certain things, and it's just because of a great shift like Gaiseric that the Vandals basically made it. But also in there, these Germanic populations were running quite short in manpower. There was just a few tens of thousand warriors they could field, and now they were also very difficult to control politically, especially after they had settled down these Romanized lands. So you see, the perspective is very, very varied. And talking about the Symmacharii, this is very interesting because it shows you really a process that was stepping towards this direction, and that was starting to happen because of transformation of the Roman military from some century now, so that the Numeri system basically had vanished. I mean, had not vanished, on the contrary, was kind of arguably stronger than ever, given that the Numeri had been regularized in the army. But it was what I meant is that this process of integration and catalyzation of these foreign contingents that now had stopped, for which you had to necessarily draw them from the outside, not from the Roman provinces that had still to be Romanized through this process, also participation to the military. So okay, and as you see, we could say else about the Symmacharii, but this is the problem. We don't really know who they were cent for cent, but there were this very wide ensemble of troops that in one way or another were now hiring from outside the borders into the Roman army, which needed them in turn, and that really was functioning now on the base of these troops that were extremely useful, especially in the frontiers, and that were quite effective and could maintain the high tactical standards of the Roman army, thanks to these specializations that otherwise in the rest of the empire, the populations of the empire had been lost due to gentrification and that the Romanization had entailed. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.